Hello, welcome back to another video. I started painting these gorgeous lavender flowers and it took me a total of 10 flowers until I was finally happy. As an artist, we sometimes are too hard on ourselves and see problems that aren't there. I already had a friend ask me to adopt a part of the lavender army because to others my failed attempts just look great. With today's video, I want to save you some time and show you how to paint a lavender flower in a jar without needing 10 attempts. So let's get painting. A full list of materials is in the description below. Let's start with the outline. I like to paint the rim of the jar first, as it gives me the opportunity to center the jar on the page. For this painting, the outline is just a rough sketch. I use it as a guideline to show me where things need to be in the final artwork. In order for the lines to be visible in this video, the pencil lines are a little stronger than they normally would be. To add some more interest to the painting, the view on the glass will be slightly from above. This gives me the opportunity to add some perspective by adding the elements from the back of the jar, which can be seen through the glass. To simplify the painting, I could just draw a head-on view of the glass, but where's the fun in that? I like to also draw in the waterline, as this helps later with the branches. Lavender has an almost triangular shape. I draw in lines to guide me later in positioning the lavender branches. In this painting there will be a total of 5 branches. 1 branch in the center, 1 on each side and 2 in the back, meaning in between the middle branch and the branches on the outside. All branches should be spread out and not touch. The bottom of the stems should overlap in the glass to make it look more realistic. Let's start painting. First, I activate the watercolors with water. I like to use a spray bottle for that. Next, I premix the paints. Watercolors dry pretty fast, on paper and on the palette. For this painting, you need to work quick, so premixing some watercolors really helps. The blue and permanent rose are not fully mixed together in some areas of the palette. This gives me the opportunity to create a gentle difference in color in the flowers, making the painting more interesting. This is where I messed up one of the paintings. I mixed the watercolors together too much, resulting in almost no color variations. The lavender just looked boring, like one block of purple. Mixing the colors together too much also caused issues because the multiple branches of lavender are hard to tell apart. I intentionally chose very strong colors for the lavender. It makes it easier to paint the larger color variations, making the painting more interesting. In another of the paintings, the color was just wrong. I added way too much pink for my liking. And while it looked good during the painting process, it did not look as good once it was dry. So if I have any doubts about the color, I just play it safe and add more blue. Painting the lavender branches is easy in principle, but requires some know-how. I load the brush with watercolor and start dabbing it on the paper. I start at the top, working my way down. This depends on the paper, but with this paper, when I reach the bottom end of the lavender, the very top is all ready to dry to continue working on it. This is another way I messed up one of the previous paintings. There should be plenty of white space left between the watercolor dabs. One of the mistakes in a previous painting was that I did not leave enough white space, resulting in a purple blob. Once my brush runs out of watercolor, I reload it with water only. There is watercolor left in the brush and this will result in a lighter color. When I reload the brush from the palette, I make sure to reload from the target color. The branch in the center is more on the blue side, so I reload from that area of the palette. Since I want the color to vary, I make sure to always load the brush with a slighter different shade of blue. Alternating between loading the brush with watercolor and just water will result in a greater color variation, making the whole lavender branch look more interesting. In addition, the branch on the left is more on the dark purple side and the branch on the right is more on the pink side. This will not only make it look more interesting, but make it easier to tell the difference between the branches. The final shape of the lavender should be like a cone, pointy at the top, wider at the bottom. I got this wrong in one of the previous paintings, simply because I got taken away. The bottom ended up being too wide, getting too close to the other branches. The branches in the middle and outside should not touch at the bottom or barely touch. If they touch, there needs to be a larger color difference. Otherwise, they will be hard to tell apart. Also, keep in mind that the colors can bleed into each other. This can look cool, but with the different shades of colors used for each branch, it's a gamble. Let's add some more detail. I mixed burnt umber and lamp black to create a light wash of dark brown. Using a small brush, I add stems to the lavender and some little pieces of stem that are visible in between the lavender blooms. The brown color can and should bleed into the lavender. It should not be enough to take over and create a large spot in the lavender. If you want the watercolor to bleed more, or if you work slow and the paper is already dry for bleeds, you could add the branch to each individual lavender once you finished it. Using a small brush allows me to create smaller lines. If the lines are too wide, it draws too much attention to them. This is another mistake I made in one of the paintings. The color should also be dulled by the lamp black. Just burnt umber is too light and bright. I paint the stems only from where they submerge into the jar to the flower part. This is another mistake I made in a previous painting. The stems are lighter and harder to see through the thick rim of the jar, and I was just too eager to paint them. Adding little pieces of the branch that are visible in the flower part is not a must. If you feel unsure about it, just leave it or limit it to only painting parts of the branch that goes through the very center. Especially if you chose a lighter color palette than I did, it is easy to mess up the painting with too many way too strong branches. The last two lavender flowers are in the back and therefore further away. They are painted using the exact same method as before for the other lavender flowers. When you only realize that the color is too dark once you added the first dots to the page, try dipping your brush into the water jar and adding almost clear water only. The previous dots should bleed into the new dots, diluting the color on the paper. To create the illusion of space, I mix in more water to the watercolor, creating a very faint wash. There will also not be as many details and no brown branches peeking out in between the flowers. One of the mistakes I made in a previous painting is not to leave enough white space. Another mistake was that the color was too strong. I did not mix in enough water. The third mistake I made is to use colors that are too similar to those of the nearby lavenders. With a light wash, it can sometimes be hard to create a color variation. While the pigment is still wet, I add a tiny little bit of pigment to it and let it bleed. It is easy to get it wrong and adding colors that are just too strong, so start gentle. Another hack I learned is to add watercolor to the area around the center first, and then use a brush with water only to dab the area around it. letting the pigment disperse via bleeding. The edge of the flower will be softer, as there is naturally not as much pigment bleeding all the way to that area. Use whatever method works best for you. The stems for the background lavender are also painted a little lighter. I just add more water to the mix. Let's move on to painting the jar. For this part, it is best to use a larger brush, which can hold more watercolor. Imperfections make this part of the painting just even better. I start with a very light wash of blue. I apply the blue watercolor to the left side of the jar. Next, I fill my brush with water only and apply that to the area next to it. This allows the blue watercolor to bleed into the water. The two areas are not perfectly touching, leaving some dry areas. I then do the same to the right side of the jar. In a realistic painting, both sides of the round object are darker to create the illusion of roundness. Not as much light hits those areas. I'm using this principle to create a sense of space and roundness, even though it is just a loose painting. Next, I'm darkening the bottom of the jar, as well as the area around the rim. Remember to not apply the watercolor or water in a perfect, even wash. When my brush is just a little too dry and leaves dry patches at the first stroke, I leave them. Imperfection is the key. The water line from the water in the jar leaves a shadow visible from the outside, so I need to paint that in. I have some Prussian blue and black mix from earlier on the palette. I use that to add just a little more pigment to some of the shadows where I feel they came out too light. I then mix up some Prussian blue and lamp black for more accents. The mistake I made in earlier paintings is to add too much dark watercolor to the jar. While the mix is the same as I used before, I need to restrain myself to make sure to not overuse it. Applying it to the wet watercolor will make the dark paint bleed, just a little. This is the look I want. If the painting is already too dry, I need to let it dry completely and then re-wet the areas that I want to paint on. Since the paper is not evenly wet, the watercolor will not bleed out evenly. This is the look I'm going for. There will be a difference in how white the watercolor bleeds out, depending on the wetness of the paper. When the paper is still pretty wet, it bleeds out wider. For this reason, I add watercolor slowly over several minutes as it dries. The rim of the jar has some creases to twist on a lid. Adding them in a realistic manner is not necessary. Suggesting them is perfect for the look of this painting. I suggest them by adding darkness for the thicker glass or even the shadows they cast. It is tempting here to overwork the jar, introduce new colors, change to a smaller brush to add more details, or paint in all the white space. I fell for some of those traps in my previous paintings, and I hope you can learn from that. The water in the jar can be a challenge to paint if you try it with too many details. I made that mistake earlier as well. I simply add some of the light blue color to the dark color left in my brush and apply to the paper. I then use a clean, wet brush to move the pigment around in a few confident strokes. I see a spot here where the watercolor did bleed out a little too wide, so I wash out the brush and use it as a sponge to soak up the pigment. If there's too much water left in the brush, it can cause blooms, something that happened earlier as well, in a different painting. While the watercolor is still wet, I can add pigments to add more structure, shadows, and reflections. Let's go back to the lavender. It should be dry at this time and ready for some details. The purple color on the palette had a few minutes to dry by now, making it more concentrated. I pick up some of those pigments with a brush and add some darker dots to the lavender. Learning from my mistakes, do not overdo it. I also use the same colors for each lavender that I used for the first layer of watercolor. The flower in the center is mainly bluish, so the dots will be more on the blue side, and so on. The lavender in the back will not get any dots. They are in the background and therefore out of focus. Adding a second layer and therefore details would disturb the illusion. We are going to hit fast forward here and get straight to the next step. Let's finish up the branches. Some of them are out of focus. The part of the branches that is clearly visible goes from the bottom of the rim to where they enter the water. Remember that they enter the water somewhere in the middle of the jar, not by the outer water line. The branches are out of focus in the water and behind the thick rim. I re-wet those areas where they are out of focus and add the branches with a slightly more diluted burnt umber lamp black mix. The branches in the water have different lengths, so you need to consider that when painting them. They are also fuzzy and out of focus. This adds to the illusion of water. They should bleed out quite a bit. If there is no pigment left at the original branch, I let the paper dry a little and then reapply some watercolor while the paper is still damp. If you do not like the way a branch did bleed out, you can soak it up with a dried off brush or a paper towel and try again. If some shadows of the brown pigment are left behind, it just adds to the overall loose style. Once the painting is dry, I can erase the last of the pencil lines. Thank you so much for watching my video. I'm really eager to hear from you what issues you encountered while painting with watercolors, so please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. I hope to see you soon with the next video.